I understand why it can be very hard to listen to sort of my diatribes, and I do have to make a certain requisite amount of preemptive apologies for essentially trousing the general form that intellectual discourse takes, which requires usually for it to be incisive and have any utility, a kind of knowledge at hand. And I do have a certain knowledge at hand, but it isn't, let's say, in the delicate detail. And and I do have to profess a strange kind of expertise, uh, taking into account those kinds of apologies in certain ideological matters and things like that. I'm actually quite knowledgeable in Marxism, although not being directly well read in it, and I know that is almost impossible for someone who produced the amount of voluminous work, Marx and Engels did. But over the course of around 10 years in my teenage years, I hung around revolutionary leftist forums and things like that. And I am actually quite well read, specifically in the parts of the Marxist literature in which Marx sets out all the caveats for all of his kind of philosophical frameworks. And having studied those, and having studied the different species of Marxist interpretation, I'm quite familiar with the theory, although not in the letter of the theory. So that might sound quite weird, but especially I think it's actually with the kind of certain philosophical structure that at least Marxism is. I think it's actually quite a useful thing to actually retrace uh, what is actually going on from the caveats issued, um, and things like that. So I am probably going to make many mistakes, but I think thematically there will be things that will be salvageable in what I say. And I think that with just some form of charity, intellectual charity, and sort of, I think, and I'm going to make very stark accusations and complaints and things like that. And perhaps I should start off with the synthesis of my conclusion, let's just say, and then perhaps that'll at least impel some people to continue to listen to my ranting and diatribing and such. Um, so I consider the Marxist analysis to be a very important tool, intellectual tool. Um, I like to think that I understand exactly what it is, and I think it's an indispensable form of analysis. But I do think that it is not wholly useful. It's not prescriptive in any way, and it does offer some insight, but that insight still has to be worked on and synthesized. And I think almost without, because there are, in some sense, the Marxist dialectical materialism, it because of how it's philosophically set up, it has its own emphasis built into it, which I do think is an unwieldy reductionism. Uh, it's still it's a reductionism that holds a lot of water in some ways, but without being nuanced by a broader sort of more general sensitivity to things, which Marx, I think, even exemplified about his own thinking. I mean, basically that dialectical materialism is not going to be predictive. It's not going to actually tell you what's going to go on, because culture itself, essentially an immaterial aspect of culture, might manifest in such a way so as to obviate the potential of class consciousness, that there might be some kind of religious thing or something like that. So there is this compartmentalization essentially between the immaterial sort of cast off aspects to human history, which which are a kind of annoyance from the level of interpretation via dialectical materialism. Um, and like on this point, which I think should be a kind of amoral or at least neutral, morally neutral sort of issue, and perhaps even a rich issue that needs its own sort of contemplation. There is obviously a Marxist incentive to sort of just cast it off as being the white noise, essentially. And that I think also gets rid of certain psychological aspects. I think that, so. My broader thing would be, I think, in some sense, Mikhail Bakunin got it all right. He is, in my sense, a more intellectual powerhouse than Marx was. Although when you're dealing with a kind of rational reductionist sort of thing, you can more elaborately get into things. Bakunin is more sophisticated, nuanced, dealing with the psyche in relation to, let's say, cultural and material and legal sort of things. But there are so many issues that Marxism essentially doesn't know how to treat, and it's because this whole recording I'm making as a response to a professor in Pakistan. I've forgotten his name. I must look it up. I watched one of his videos about fascism, which I didn't finish watching, talking about the philosophical roots of fascism. I mean, I see a lot of problems with his defense of Marxism, which, I mean, he was basically criticizing Jordan Peterson. And I cringe when I listen to Jordan Peterson complain about Marxism, because he's almost talking about this wave of postmodernist neo-Marxism, and I think he's more correct when he's more correct when he's criticizing neo-Marxism than when he's criticizing classical Marxism. But I think that there are those toxic elements which has even been adopted into the and this is because there are, I think, problems with Marxist modeling and reductionism. So even in the video that now this is a response to, which was a response to Jordan Peterson, it's very easy to complain that Jordan Peterson isn't talking about, he isn't fixing the nuanced internal incoherence and problems that Marxism kind of proliferates in its adherents and in its interpreters. And that is because there is a brittle, rigidity and almost a tautological sort of issue, which I think is actually explored quite nicely by this professor, because he first says that class is not merely defined by economic class, essentially, and therefore it's a broader claim to say that history is the product of class struggle, and essentially class is just defined by exploitation. Now, the biggest problem with Marxism is frankly this notion of exploitation. Is that if you are going to give that a kind of ontological pedestal, and exploitation is a kind of pristine aspect or feature or qualia that can sort of creep into sociological factors. I mean, the problem with Marxism essentially is that it's a sociological reduction. And when you sort of treat exploitation as this kind of, and you can just have a plethora of different forms of exploitation. And so, I mean, in this professor's defense of Marxism being broader, he actually, I think, more clearly shows the propensity that it has to sort of lend its credence to this postmodern interpretation in terms of identity politics, in a gradation of classes that involve all these other kinds of cultural exploitations and things like that, or social status exploitations, or however. But the problem is that, if you can summarize, let's say, the thing that would make the Marxist analysis have any utility for anyone thinking or philosophizing about society, is almost the famous sort of goal of, let's say, transcending, let's say, the obstacle that dialectical materialism describes is that you're going to have at some point a classless society, or just be locked into a never-ending sort of repeat of these processes, which human beings will effectively be the unwitting pawns of. And so it's almost a sense to control the sociological level of analysis and to sort of bring it inside of culture, rather than having it mechanistically plague culture in a kind of unconscious way. So it's almost like, let's make this paradigm a conscious cultural artifact that we can deliberate over and perhaps politicize, or at least have a polity that or a political economy that interfaces with it. So that's the kind of the sort of the looming sort of question around Marxism. Okay, and you can also, again, you can see how this sort of lent itself to the identity politics sort of interpretation of things. The problem is that when you are dealing with exploitation of one class by another class, that is perhaps a reductionism which is just not capable of being like you might be able to, almost like in the medical field, you can use epitheliology to work out, like that that there's a heavy correlation between certain symptoms and certain outcomes and certain inputs and outputs, and you can see that people that seem to eat this collection of food will have that kind of outcome or something like that. But correlation is not causation, essentially, and the idea that that exploitation is the objective narrative that should be used to kind of categorize and designate and resolve and reconcile, that it is the ultimate evil, even, is something that needs to be examined. And you can see this in the brittleness of the thinking even of this professor, who later says that essentially the problem with capitalism, and he gives it due regard, as Marx gives it due regard, that it is a better form of economic relations and society, or organizing principle of society, than all those before it. It has created material conditions that are superior to all the other systems before it. That he complains that it's not as efficient as it could be on the macro level, or something like that. That it's irresponsible on a certain macro level. Now, you see, the problem with this is that it's a blind skeptical complaint. It's like, well, something could be better. It could just be better, but you haven't actually described it. He sort of alludes that socialism would just be better on a macro scale or something like that. He doesn't actually make that argument. He suggests it, and one can imagine the sentiment. I can imagine a better system than capitalism, but it's not better in the sense of preserving libertarian political consciousness, let's just say. I would say the biggest problem with the Marxist analysis is that it doesn't neatly fit in with the libertarian political philosophy in some sense. It almost, to simplify it, it needs a kind of totalitarian-esque sort of thing. Now, there are ways in which you can have a system that is worked in order to sort of remove class exploitation, but sadly you get other forms of oppression which seem unavoidable, and in fact the only way to, let's say, avoid them from a libertarian political standpoint is to make them consensual, is to make sure that people actually agree. And at some point you can only actually agree to buy into, let's say, that level of systemic structure, which could be an unconscious exploitation, is to have an alternative, is to have a way to opt out of the system. So unless you have a kind of plethora of competing systems that each have their own different sort of package of relations, that all in some sense don't have class exploitation within them, or at least they have forms of exploitation which aren't grounded in class. Again, the problem is that class is defined by exploitation, and class is also only real because it's not unique to an individual. It is a kind of group experience, and so it sort of privileges the sociological sort of reduction of society, and it is quite alien from, let's say, the more sophisticated thought of someone like Mikhail Bakunin, which has the kind of these problems are more a kind of psychosocial, or at least in the psychology of the individual, is the nexus of a lot of the evil and the problems that we see, which essentially Marx would complain can sort of throw a spanner into the works, because he almost only sees it as a negative form of ignorance that can plague and slow down and jam the works of dialectical materialism, which has this sort of implicit promise built into it, although it's not a predictive promise, that we either will transcend the obstacle that dialectical materialism describes, or we won't. Now, so from an obtuse perspective, it is an interesting litmus test, in essence, because you can say, well, are we actually going to resolve this problem? Is this the time in history where we can actually see a synthesis in which we can actually transcend, let's say, the forces of history which are plaguing us on the sociological thing? Now, again, I think that it can show you the outline of something else that needs to be tackled. It can show you problems, but I don't think the problem is actually described by the Marxist analysis directly. And that is simply because exploitation is not a simple topic. I mean, and here's the other explanation of that and substantiation of that is supposedly the bourgeoisie, the ones who own the means of production, are exploiting those who do not own the means of production because of the surplus value, etc., and the capitalist rent. But essentially, I mean, the only way that you can get around this, and I think that this was embarrassingly got around by this just sort of suggestion, is that you still need consumers, and essentially capitalists, the bourgeoisie, still need to fulfill the needs of their market. Okay, so this exploitation that is happening is only happening also by being able to deliver to people. And, and essentially this increase, let's just say, of better bourgeoisie are able to out-wealth the other sections of the bourgeoisie that can even fall out of the bourgeoisie, or at least become less and less relevant, is because essentially they're fighting against each other in order to sate the desires and needs or whatever. And yes, you can make some kind of macroeconomic thing that it's causing externalities, it's causing other problems or whatever. But so to merely just describe it as exploitation between these two classes is to overlook the fundamental concept of access. So who cares if wealth becomes more concentrated? Yes, access to wealth might become more scarce, but access to everything else, in fact, is not becoming more scarce. It's becoming more plentiful, and by the process of the bourgeoisie trying to outwit and displace the wealth of the other bourgeoisie and to concentrate it within themselves, that the inter-class competition, let's just say, which is completely hidden in the Marxist reduction of capitalism, means that there are also positive externalities, which it doesn't sort of even account for and factor in. Which, I mean, you could say, in some sense, it basically does, because it sings capitalism's praises as being better than everything else. So, all they end up with is this vague skeptical prescription that there's something better than capitalism. Well, yes, let's use our imaginations that not yet have a kind of a particular articulation. This professor then goes through a kind of cherry-picking some aspects of some recent history, some societies. He uses sub-Saharan Africa as a class example. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to use class in that way. As an example of how liberalizing free markets does not create growth, and he uses China as an example of kind of the force of socialism being very good at alleviating poverty. This is just completely, this is just nonsense. If you actually look at the detail of these things, to describe describe sub-Saharan Africa as liberalizing its economy is when South Africa is going in the opposite direction quite distinctly, and it's being done so because of essentially identity politics, and which has sabotaged the economy and to a large extent. I mean, essentially, everything is going backwards, and in fact, the kind of identity politics that is destroying the kind of the labor market, the functioning of markets in general, and we have an overregulated and we have an overtaxed economy in South Africa. If you remove South Africa from the sub-Saharan Africa basket, you actually start getting positive growth in the region. So that example just sort of falls off. And again, to describe, I'm not going to get into the complexities, but obviously to describe China as a kind of socialistic sort of, I mean, yes, I'll grant that it's some kind of synthesis, but in some sense, it's not a planned economy, or, okay, let me just not get into it, but let me just say it's obviously wrong to call China a kind of not capitalistic, and it's just, it's intellectually dishonest. Okay. I mean, I mean, my particular solution to these things, right, is if you allow, let's say, the creation of what I would call substates. You allow essentially people to create their own cooperatives that effectively become like their own internal alternative economies. And essentially, there's nothing really stopping you from doing this in a liberal democratic society, and especially one with some kind of decent constitution which gives a kind of libertarian political sort of freedom. You can use that freedom to work within the constructs of the law to essentially set up your own alternative model economy. And you try to essentially, maybe obviously you can't do everything for yourself internally, so you have to have some kind of trade, but collectively, you basically try to buy your freedom from the market by setting up your own internal production capacity. And then you can also use, let's say, what makes the engine of capitalism useful, what makes the magic of capitalism really, and is that when you increase investment into capital, productive capital, you basically increase wealth, because you use capital investment to substitute for inputs. So you have to have less inputs because you've got a more sophisticated concentration of a kind of an efficient means of production. And so you're kind of displacing inputs with efficiency, but that costs concentration of capital investment. So as long as you have a system that has some surplus and it's investing that surplus in production capacity in some sense, or no, I'm saying the wrong term, not production capacity, but production efficiency, let's just say. And also, if you're in your own system, right, you can design your own. You can design your own. What do you call it? Waste. You can design the waste in your production process. You can tailor your waste essentially to be useful for other production lines. So basically, you don't choose to make something in such a way so as to make it the cheapest. You actually try to maximize the value of the waste which is useful. So you only make useful waste, and you kind of create a circular system. Now, in which everything is interwoven into everything else, and you just find a way to do things that are essentially more sustainable, because you don't care about the lowest unit cost of production, because it's a closed loop essentially, and you're trying to keep that loop as tight as possible. Now, when you do things like that, you're effectively running a monopoly, which you can't even do in a capitalist sort of society. But if it's a cooperative, that's a non-profit thing. Essentially, you're banding together with other people, with other citizens, and you're going to create a common amenity that you're going to sort of function and maintain, perhaps within, because obviously you're going to need people in-house to run the thing, or you're going to have something that is so profitable that it can buy things to run it, or eventually you can automate the whole thing perhaps. I mean, there's so many problems with this on a social level, because it's like, well, if you free people from the market, you know, you've kind of removed them from forces that we have been adapting to you know, I mean, if you're going to remove class from social consciousness, and you know, it's not going to be easy to have other systems that can actually, let's say, culturally cope with this new way of being. I think that's actually the biggest challenge, because everything I've described is not illegal. It's not hard to do. There's nothing stopping anyone from doing it. The reason why it doesn't happen is simply because people aren't ready. They're not interested, and perhaps psychologically, even, and individually, um, they don't like responsibility. They don't like accountability. They rather complain that they are being oppressed as a class than actually make a plan to actually overcome and transcend that oppression, which they could already work towards an effect within the system. I also think that once you start having enclaves, like I describe, if they're even capable of being sustainable in this way, and when I say capable of being sustainable, I mean, because I'm very pessimistic that a group of people can even maintain such a culture. But if they are, they would be in a very good position essentially to help solve problems in the world, because they would essentially be free to a large extent from the general kind of doubt and self-interest. Because if they had an independent economy or whatever, essentially they would be good actors, they would be good faith actors, because they would want everyone else to be stable and secure, because they don't want to have a nation on their border that suddenly implodes and everyone now is destitute and becomes like, you know, a kind of post-apocalyptic Mad Men 3. They just want everyone to be chill, they want everyone to be calm, and perhaps they want to encourage other people to follow their model so that everyone else can be peaceful and cool, you know. But, you know, there are also religious things why this can't happen. There's lots of ideology in the world that is an obstacle to this. But, I mean, obviously the best thing would be to have it working as a model, and then that would be the model for a new way of being that then other people could choose to follow if they so wished. And in fact, if I was in such a society, I would even help keep capitalism alive in other countries in some sense. I would try to be responsible. I would try to provide things to that market. I would even go the extra mile to sell things to it in order to help stabilize it, to be a kind of friendly neighbor. Because you don't want these systems imploding and creating, you know, and you want to perhaps say, well, look, if you want to join us, you can. If you want to create your own, we'll help you create your own, you know, like to have some kind of way of a kind of remedial thing in which you're encouraging other people to go with the solution, but you're also just trying to stabilize things, so as to remove. I mean, you know, if capitalism supposedly, I mean, I think this would actually help provide a lifeline to capitalism, and it would actually keep capitalism healthy, because the problem that capitalism suffers from is that it doesn't have a flaw. Essentially, whenever you have an artificial flaw, like you try to have a kind of minimum wage imposed, it fucks up the market tremendously. But if people actually have an alternative, they can say, no, I don't have to live in the market, I can go and join something else. That means that the market already has to sophisticate itself and to increase its productivity. It has to match the level of essentially capital investment to make work so productive that they can actually compete with the alternative. So, you know, like you sort of, it raises the bar, and you know, I mean, this is problematic as well, because the engine of capitalism has probably been broken by this weird state that has sort of got versions of tax to such a degree that you have actually destroyed the kind of the engine of yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what we're suffering from is not even the direct problem. It's not the kind of the capitalist collapse as is sort of anticipated by Marxism. It's actually something else. It's actually the invalidation. Okay, this is somewhat, this is related, but it's not, I don't know if I want to get into this. But the sort of, the idea that people just get thrown out of work and things like that, I mean, it looks like that we are heading in that direction in some sense, and this has to do with and a lot of the problems that we have in so-called capitalism today I would generally say is not because of the kind of the core problem that Marx anticipates in capitalism that eventually destroys it, which is essentially the obsolescence and the replacement of consumers of workers, which are also consumers. So essentially the death pill of capitalism simplistically is that people in industries, they want other consumers, they want to fire their own worker slash consumers, but they want other worker slash consumers to be paid more, and so there's an inherent self-contradiction there. The problem that we're suffering from is kind of like a fake, that a lot of the economy itself is essentially been completely displaced by financial instrumentalization of options, of an immaterial financial instrument, which essentially represents a kind of mathematical reading of the future in some sense, and that I think is the only way that we've been able to sort of propel and sustain a large element of what is essentially a false economy. And I mean, a Marxist might say, and that, well, without that, capitalism itself would have already sort of matured and had the kind of the death throes or whatever. I'm not so sure about this, because I still actually think that because access to things has been increasing, that there's almost a continual opportunity for people to buy their freedom from the market. Because even though wealth has been more concentrated and that kind of sociological class inequality has increased, it's irrelevant to the larger human experience. To reduce the human experience to class exploitation, especially class exploitation, which is effectively only able to perpetuate itself by delivering to people access to increased capacities. Essentially, that is how the so-called wealth exploitation is paid for. Now, okay, the sentiment that the professor offers is essentially, well, because wealth is concentrated, therefore consumer power is also being concentrated, and therefore that they are essentially warping what is being delivered. Now, this is actually not true, because the whole almost definition of wealth is that it's not dissipated through consumerism. It's not spent in the consumer thing, So yes, they have the potential to consume, things, but largely they don't. That's how it sustains itself as wealth. And the idea that that eventually sort of explodes as a kind of exponential property, and therefore essentially everything is only I think that there's almost a mathematical fallacy attached to that. I mean, if people have so much money that they will never spend it in their lifetime, then effectively all that money that they will never be able to spend in their lifetime, it's not part of the market. And we know in terms of money that it's sort of it's not the amount of absolute money that exists that determines prices. It's effectively the disposable income calibrated by the thing that I've just described in terms of actual disposable income, not potential disposable income. What else? Yeah, so I imagine some of that is going to be laughed off as a sort of embarrassingly naive, perhaps, in some of the technical things that I have fallen foul of in some of the writings. But I didn't... Look, I mean, in some sense I can be very, very kind to Marx, because he did say a lot of things that... I mean, he said, first of all, that lots of things will happen that he will not be able to anticipate, and which will perhaps completely change the kind of... let's say, the reading of the drive of dialectical materialism. Marx, I think, also made too many concessions to his revolutionary friends and things like that, which he was always generally quite, in a technical sense, he was quite neutral toward. But I think he did end up making concessions, essentially, and also by watching, in his day, the bureaucratizing of even capitalism. I mean, he thought that essentially strong central planning was needed for capitalism, and in fact that is how capitalism was organized in his day. Essentially, it was the bureaucracy of the state seemed like an integral part of having a sophisticated industrialized economy. The size of the state grew tremendously over his lifetime, supporting the expansion of capitalism. So, he has all these ideas, essentially, which essentially I think poisoned this quite ragtag sort of vehicle of the dictatorship of the proletarian. All of that, I think, it can be jettisoned from the Marxist analysis quite easily. And in fact, even in keeping with the core precepts of the Marxist analysis, is completely dispensable, because, as I describe, I mean, you can essentially have a communistic revolution within the confines of a liberal democratic state, essentially by not overthrowing capitalism, but by essentially displacing it, on the, let's say, on the immediate scale of actually organizing your affairs. I understand people will say, "Oh, no, you're a naive. They will crush you," or whatever. But I mean, everything is possible and true. But never has it been so easy in some sense. I mean, it's not as if you have no way to protect yourself. You could use social media. You could use YouTube to try to protect your thing. You could try to document things. You could try, but I mean, likely I think that these structures are more likely to implode than they are to be hounded out of existence from external factors. There's enough internal stupidity within the psyche to prevent a successful state of affairs of maintaining a culture between people based on their own consent. I think that there are enough inbuilt problems in that which the revolutionaries never want to look at, because essentially they just want to be a new aristocracy. Yeah, I've sort of gone... Okay, I'm probably going to make an addendum to this after I think about all the things that I should have said and things that were more to the point of this professor. But anyway...